Year 1761, St. Petersburg. The city is claimed to have been built from swamp, but it appears to have been constructed with granite weighing hundreds of tons, using cutting techniques so precise they are comparable to modern times. St. Petersburg is often introduced with a sentence that feels almost rehearsed, repeated so many times that it has lost its weight. A city born from a swamp, a ruler's will imposed on mud and water. Thousands of workers driven into marshland, where the ground would not hold, where winter froze the soil into stone and summer turned it back into slurry. The image is familiar. Wooden piles hammered into soft earth, men standing knee-deep in water, fog rising from the Neva, the wind cutting through unfinished streets. It is a story of hardship, of human endurance, of ambition wrestling with nature. And for a long time, that story seems sufficient. The ground here was never meant to carry a city. The delta flooded regularly, the soil shifted, foundations sank. Contemporary accounts speak of disease, exhaustion, and death, of a place where construction fought not only time but physics itself. Even today, engineers describe the terrain as unstable, requiring constant maintenance. In the early 18th century, there were no modern pumps, no reinforced concrete, no heavy machinery capable of reshaping a landscape at scale. What existed were simple tools, human labor, and the limits imposed by gravity and material strength. This is the setting in which the city is said to have emerged. And then, almost quietly, another element enters the frame. Granite. Not small stones gathered from riverbanks, not rough blocks stacked with forgiving tolerances, but massive monoliths. Single pieces of granite weighing tens, sometimes hundreds of tons. Granite quarried far from the city itself, transported across land and water, shaped into columns, embankments, steps, and foundations with surfaces so flat and edges so clean that they still meet with near-perfect precision centuries later. Granite that resists cutting even with modern equipment, a material known for destroying tools, for demanding time, force, and control. Along the Neva's embankments, the stone appears not as an accent, but as a system. Long stretches of dressed granite fitted together with joints so tight that blades cannot slip between them. Broad steps descending to the water, each block uniform, each face smooth, each angle deliberate. In palaces and administrative buildings, granite columns rise from the ground as if they were placed rather than assembled, their proportions exact, their surfaces finished to a degree that feels strangely out of place in the narrative of mud, haste, and improvisation. The contrast is subtle at first, then difficult to ignore. On one side, a city described as rushed, improvised, forced into existence under extreme conditions. On the other, stonework that suggests planning, measurement, and a level of material control that seems to belong to a different category altogether. Granite does not forgive mistakes. It does not yield easily to uneven force or crude methods. To cut it precisely, to transport it intact, to place it accurately on unstable ground, requires coordination, technique, and an understanding of load and tolerance that goes beyond survival construction. No single granite block proves anything on its own. History is full of impressive achievements, yet the accumulation matters. The scale matters. The consistency matters. When a city born in marshland presents, at its core, a language of stone that speaks of permanence, precision, and mass, a quiet tension forms between the story we repeat and the material reality that remains in place. This is not a declaration and not an accusation. It is simply an observation. Mud and water explain hardship. Granite asks different questions. And the first of those questions, left hanging without urgency or drama, is this. What made such stonework possible here, at this time, under these conditions, at the very beginning of the 18th century? Peter the Great occupies a fixed position in the official narrative of St. Petersburg, not as a footnote but as the axis around which the entire story turns. According to the standard historical account, the city exists because he willed it into existence. In the early years of the 18th century, Russia sought a new orientation, one that faced west rather than inward. Access to the Baltic Sea was strategic, economic, and symbolic. The Neva Delta, despite its marshes and seasonal floods, offered a gateway to Europe. In 1703, the decision was made. A new city would rise there, and it would become the new capital of the Russian state. The sources describe the project as immense and unforgiving. Tens of thousands of laborers were mobilized, many of them conscripted peasants, soldiers, and prisoners. They were sent north to a landscape that resisted settlement at every level. The soil was waterlogged and unstable. Timber rotted quickly. Foundations sank. The climate worked against progress, with long winters that froze both ground and bodies, followed by summers that returned the land to mud. Mortality was high. Disease spread easily. Contemporary observers wrote of exhaustion and loss, and later historians would describe the construction as a human cost measured in lives rather than years. Yet the building continued. Canals were cut to drain the land. Wooden piles were driven into the earth to stabilize foundations. Temporary structures rose and fell as permanent ones took shape. Materials were transported by river and road. Administrative buildings, fortifications, and residences followed a planned layout inspired by European models. Streets were drawn straight, intersections deliberate, facades aligned. The city was not allowed to grow organically, it was imposed. Decrees regulated construction methods, materials, even the appearance of buildings. Stone construction was encouraged, sometimes mandated, as part of the vision of a durable capital. Historical timelines emphasize speed. Within a few decades, the city had taken on a recognizable form. By the middle of the 18th century, St. Petersburg was no longer a frontier experiment but an imperial center, hosting government institutions, academies, and courts. The narrative frames this rapid development as a triumph of organization and authority. The state commanded labor, resources were redirected, resistance was overridden. What might have taken generations elsewhere was compressed into years through centralized power. In this version of events, nothing is unexplained. The hardships are acknowledged, the deaths are noted. The technical challenges are mentioned but treated as obstacles overcome through persistence rather than innovation. The emphasis remains on political will and human effort. Peter the Great's reforms, his exposure to Western practices, and his determination to modernize Russia form the explanatory core. The city stands as evidence of that success. It is a story consistent with the broader arc of 18th century state building, one that fits comfortably within academic frameworks and archival records. And then, within this established narrative, certain physical facts begin to draw attention, not as contradictions but as additions that change the texture of the picture. Granite appears early and often in the fabric of St. Petersburg, not merely as decorative elements, but as structural components integrated into the city's foundations and public works. Embankments along the Neva are lined with massive granite blocks, each carefully shaped and fitted. Broad stairways descend to the water, formed from single stones that dwarf the human figures standing upon them. Administrative buildings rest on granite bases, their weight distributed across surfaces cut with remarkable regularity. Columns carved from single pieces of stone rise in symmetrical arrangements, their dimensions consistent across sites separated by distance and function. The physical properties of these elements are measurable. Granite is dense and heavy. Individual blocks used in embankments and foundations weigh many tons, some exceeding what would be manageable without coordinated lifting and transport systems. The stone surfaces are finished to a degree that suggests controlled cutting rather than rough shaping. Edges meet cleanly. Curves are smooth and uniform. The scale is not limited to one landmark, but repeated across the urban landscape, indicating a standardized approach rather than isolated feats. When placed alongside the accepted technological capabilities of the early 18th century, these features invite closer examination. Quarrying granite requires sustained force and durable tools. Transporting large blocks over long distances demands stable routes, vessels capable of bearing weight, and methods to prevent fracture. Precise cutting and fitting imply measurement standards and techniques that minimize error. None of these processes are impossible in principle, yet they are rarely described in detail within the conventional accounts of the city's construction. The records speak extensively about labor mobilization and urban planning, but far less about the technical workflows behind the stone itself. Who organized the extraction of such large granite pieces, and from which specific sites? How were they moved across varied terrain to a marshland city, still in the process of stabilizing its ground? What tools and methods produce such consistent results across multiple projects? These questions do not negate the established narrative, but they do extend beyond its usual boundaries. At this stage, no conclusion is required. The presence of granite does not overturn the story of Peter the Great or the hardships endured by those who built the city. It simply adds a layer of material reality that stands alongside the written record. The stone remains in place, unchanged by interpretation, and with it remain a set of practical questions, suspended rather than answered, about extraction, location, and method, waiting quietly within the very fabric of the city. To understand why the granite of St. Petersburg draws sustained attention, it is necessary to move away from dates and decrees and into the quieter territory of surfaces. Stone carries its history not only in records, but in the marks left by the tools that shaped it. When examined closely, the granite used throughout the city presents a consistency that is difficult to summarize without sounding abstract. It is not simply that the stone exists or that it is large, it is the way it has been worked. The faces of many granite blocks are remarkably flat, not approximately flat, not unevenly dressed, but planar over broad areas, maintaining a uniformity that becomes apparent when light travels across them. Reflections move smoothly. Shadows do not break abruptly along unintended ridges. The joints between adjacent blocks meet with a precision that limits variation to narrow margins. In stairways and embankments, individual stones align so closely that the boundary between them is defined more by a thin line than by a gap. This degree of flatness suggests controlled removal of material, not sporadic chipping or opportunistic shaping. Edges and corners reinforce this impression. Granite is unforgiving at its margins. When struck without control, it fractures unpredictably. Yet, in St. Petersburg, edges remain sharp where they were intended to be sharp, rounded where curves were required, and consistent across repeated elements. Columns display uniform diameters along their length. Steps maintain regular riser heights and tread depths, even when formed from single blocks rather than assembled pieces. Angles meet cleanly, without the cumulative errors that often emerge when large objects are shaped incrementally. Surface textures provide further clues. Many granite faces show parallel striations, subtle and evenly spaced, running in consistent directions. These marks indicate systematic cutting rather than random impact. They are not the deep scars left by heavy splitting alone, nor the chaotic traces of hand chisels working uneven stone. Instead, they suggest a process in which material was removed in controlled passes, each one contributing to a predictable result. In some cases, these traces are so regular that they resemble the patterns produced by later industrial methods, even if the tools themselves were different. At this point, comparison becomes unavoidable. The commonly acknowledged tools of the early 18th century were simple by modern standards. Iron chisels, wedges, hammers, saws with abrasive slurries, and manual polishing techniques were available. These methods were capable of producing finished stone, and they had been used effectively for centuries. Ancient and medieval builders accomplished impressive feats with limited technology. However, such work typically left visible irregularities, variations tied closely to the skill and fatigue of individual craftsmen and to the constraints of working time and material hardness. Modern stoneworking, by contrast, relies on sustained force, precise alignment, and repeatability. Machine-driven saws, rotating cutters, and calibrated abrasives produce surfaces that are consistent across large areas. The result is not just accuracy, but uniformity. What stands out in St. Petersburg is not that the granite looks modern in a literal sense, but that it exhibits a level of repeatable precision across many structures produced within a relatively narrow historical window. The question, then, does not hinge on whether 18th century craftsmen could shape granite at all. They clearly could. The question rests on scale and consistency. How were such large quantities of dense stone processed to similar tolerances across multiple sites, under the constraints of time, climate, and manpower described in the historical record? What sequences of cutting, dressing, and finishing were employed to achieve surfaces that remain so stable centuries later? And where, within the surviving documentation, are these processes described in operational detail? This is where the record grows quiet. Official histories focus on outcomes rather than methods. They document decisions, expenditures, and timelines. They mention quarries, but rarely specify techniques. They acknowledge labor, but not the workflows that translated raw stone into finished components with such regularity. Manuals and treatises from the period discuss stoneworking in general terms, yet they seldom address projects of this magnitude carried out at this speed. No single absence proves anything. Historical documentation is uneven by nature. Many practical details were transmitted orally or lost over time. Yet when the physical evidence invites technical questions, and the written sources offer only broad strokes in response, a gap forms between what is visible and what is described. It is a gap defined not by speculation, but by missing explanation. The granite does not argue. It does not claim to be impossible. It simply presents its surfaces, its edges, and its marks, unchanged. The stone shows that it was cut, and cut well. What it does not show, at least not directly, is the full sequence of decisions, tools, and techniques that made those cuts possible. And it is within that silence, between material result and textual description, that the question of how quietly takes shape, waiting without insistence for further examination. Granite does not arrive at a construction site by implication. It must come from somewhere specific, along routes that can bear its weight, at times of year when movement is possible. In the case of St. Petersburg, the accepted sources of the stone lie far from the city itself, hundreds of kilometers away, scattered across regions defined by forests, rivers, lakes, and uneven ground. The distance alone introduces complexity. The terrain multiplies it. Marshland gives way to dense woodland, then to rocky outcrops and waterways that freeze and thaw with the seasons. Each segment imposes its own limits on speed, load, and reliability. Historical records do acknowledge transport. They speak of barges moving along rivers and canals, of sledges crossing frozen ground in winter, of carts pulled by animals during warmer months. These methods were well known, and they had been used elsewhere with success. Winter, in particular, offered advantages. Frozen rivers and hardened soil could temporarily support heavier loads than summer mud. In theory, massive stone could be dragged across ice, guided slowly, inch by inch, toward its destination. In theory, waterways could carry stone on rafts and barges, provided the vessels were strong enough and the currents forgiving. What the records describe in general terms, however, they rarely quantify. They do not consistently specify the number of stones moved, their individual weights, or the frequency of transport required to sustain construction at the scale observed. They do not dwell on loss rates, breakage, or delays caused by weather. The Neva Basin is not a single, uniform corridor, but a network of shifting conditions. Spring floods could undo months of work. Summer heat softened ground. Autumn rains returned instability. Winter opened pathways but shortened daylight and strained human endurance. The challenge becomes clearer when considered as a system rather than a series of isolated feats. One granite embankment block might be explained as an exceptional effort. Dozens, arranged sequentially along kilometers of riverbank, suggest routine. Columns placed across multiple sites imply repetition. Foundations laid beneath different buildings indicate parallel workflows rather than singular achievements. Transport, in this context, ceases to be a background detail and becomes a central requirement, one that must operate continuously and predictably over many years. Comparisons help to frame the issue without dramatizing it. Other European cities built in stone during the same period relied heavily on local materials or navigable routes that minimized overland hauling. Even then, construction schedules stretched across decades. Projects advanced in stages, interrupted by war, finance, or logistics. In St. Petersburg, the environment offered fewer natural advantages, yet the stone appears in volume, consistently, and early in the city's development. This observation does not invalidate the recorded methods. Barges, sledges, and carts were real and capable within limits. It does, however, highlight an imbalance between description and outcome. The means are named, but their deployment at the required scale is not explored in detail. The narrative acknowledges difficulty without fully mapping its operational resolution. As with the cutting of the stone, the process is affirmed, while the mechanics remain lightly sketched. That same pattern extends into the question of time. The city's construction is often characterized by urgency. Decrees accelerated progress. Labor was compelled. Deadlines were imposed by political necessity. The chronology shows major granite works completed within relatively short spans, sometimes overlapping with one another. Embankments were laid while palaces rose. Foundations were set as facades took shape. The sequence suggests coordination across multiple fronts, each dependent on the timely arrival and preparation of heavy materials. When compared with contemporary projects elsewhere in Europe, The pace stands out. Stone cities did not emerge overnight. Even with favorable conditions, monumental construction moved cautiously, constrained by finance, craftsmanship, and transport. St. Petersburg's growth curve appears steeper. The interval between planning and completion narrows. What is usually a generational process compresses into a few decades. This compression raises questions about organization rather than possibility. To maintain such momentum, extraction, transport, cutting, and placement would need to align with minimal interruption. Seasonal windows would have to be used efficiently. Labor would need to be directed not only in large numbers but with precision. Delays in one area would cascade through the system, yet the physical record suggests continuity rather than fragmentation. The historical account credits centralized authority for this efficiency, and that explanation carries weight. A state capable of redirecting resources and enforcing compliance can overcome obstacles that would stall less coordinated societies. Still, the difference between authority and execution remains significant. Command can demand results, but it does not substitute for methods. The timeline tells us that granite structures appeared quickly. It does not fully show how the rhythm of work was sustained across distance, climate, and material resistance. Here again, the issue is not contradiction but proportion. The accepted story explains intent and outcome with confidence. Between those 2 points lies a span filled with practical challenges that receive comparatively little attention. The stone arrived, the city rose. The interval between remains thinly described, and it is within that interval, measured in seasons and years rather than moments, that the question of transport and tempo quietly persists, not as a challenge to history, but as an invitation to look more closely at how such momentum was maintained. As the physical evidence accumulates, attention inevitably shifts from what survives to what does not. Archives preserve decisions, decrees, budgets, and names. They catalogue outcomes and milestones. What they do not consistently preserve, at least not in accessible or consolidated form, are the technical pathways that led from intention to execution. In the case of St. Petersburg's granite infrastructure, this absence becomes noticeable not because it is unusual in isolation, but because of the scale and coherence of what remains standing. Detailed technical drawings are largely absent from the record. There are plans showing facades, street alignments, and elevations, but few documents that break granite work down into operational stages. Measurements of load distribution, tolerances for joint fitting, or step-by-step quarrying procedures are not commonly found. There is little that resembles a comprehensive engineering dossier explaining how massive stone elements were standardized, transported, and installed across multiple projects simultaneously. The city presents finished forms without leaving behind a corresponding trail of technical explanation. Descriptions of machinery follow a similar pattern. Historical sources mention tools in general terms, referencing cranes, winches, sledges, and lifting frames without lingering on design specifics. The reader is left with an outline rather than a blueprint. There are no surviving accounts that describe specialized devices developed specifically to handle granite on this scale, nor diagrams that show how forces were managed during cutting or placement. If such machines existed, their forms and capacities are not clearly recorded. If existing tools were adapted in novel ways, those adaptations are rarely detailed. Equally sparse are references to experimental stages. Large-scale engineering projects typically involve trial and error, especially when dealing with difficult materials under challenging conditions. Yet the documentation offers little insight into failed attempts, broken stones, or abandoned methods. There are few mentions of prototypes, test cuts, or mock assemblies used to refine techniques before full deployment. The record moves quickly from concept to completion, as though the intermediate phases either proceeded smoothly or were not considered worth noting. Against these absences stand undeniable presences. The granite structures themselves remain intact. Embankments follow consistent patterns. Foundations align with architectural plans. Stone elements across the city share dimensions, finishes, and proportions, suggesting coordination rather than improvisation. The system works. It has endured centuries of freeze and thaw, water pressure, and urban use. Whatever processes produced it, they did so with enough reliability to create a unified material language across a vast construction effort. This contrast between missing documentation and surviving coherence forms the core tension. It does not imply that records were deliberately removed or concealed. Historical archives are shaped by priorities. Administrators preserved what mattered for governance, not necessarily what explained craftsmanship. Many technical details may have been considered routine, transmitted orally, or recorded in formats that did not survive. Still, the result is a landscape where outcomes are visible and methods are faint. In response to this gap, scholars have proposed several interpretations, each grounded in established historical practice, yet none capable of closing the circle entirely. One explanation emphasizes labor. The sheer number of workers conscripted for the city's construction could, in theory, compensate for limited technology. With enough hands, stone can be quarried, hauled, and shaped using simple tools. Time, however, becomes the limiting factor. Labor-intensive methods require extended durations, and the observed pace of granite construction challenges this model. While mass labor explains effort, it strains to explain uniformity and speed simultaneously. Another hypothesis points to techniques that were once known but later fell out of use. Stoneworking traditions can be lost when economic or cultural conditions change. It is conceivable that specialized skills existed in early 18th century Russia or were imported from elsewhere, only to disappear as construction priorities shifted. This view accounts for quality without invoking advanced machinery. Its weakness lies in the lack of independent documentation. Lost techniques leave traces in texts, training lineages, or comparative sites. In this case, such traces are limited. A third interpretation suggests reuse. Perhaps some granite elements predated the city and were incorporated into new construction. If earlier structures existed in the region, their stone could have been repurposed, reducing the need for extensive quarrying and transport. Reuse is common in urban history. Yet this explanation encounters difficulties when faced with uniformity. The granite across St. Petersburg appears designed for its current context, with dimensions and finishes matched to specific architectural plans rather than adapted from disparate sources. Each of these perspectives resolves part of the problem while leaving others untouched. Labor explains scale but not precision. Lost techniques explain precision but not documentation. Reuse explains availability but not consistency. None are dismissed outright, and none fully account for all observed factors. The absence of a single, comprehensive explanation does not undermine the city's history. It simply highlights the limits of our current understanding. In this space between what is recorded and what endures, the inquiry remains open. The granite does not demand an answer, nor does it offer one. It stands as evidence of work accomplished, skill applied, and systems coordinated. The archives, meanwhile, speak in broader strokes, confident in outcomes, and quieter about means. Between the two lies a field of unanswered technical questions, not framed as accusations or revelations, but as reminders that history often preserves results more faithfully than the processes that produce them. Historical questions do not arise in a vacuum. They are shaped by the frameworks through which the past is usually approached, and those frameworks tend to favor certain kinds of explanation over others. In the case of St. Petersburg, the dominant lens has long been political and biographical. The city is understood through reigns, reforms, and personalities. It is tied to the figure of Peter the Great, to imperial ambition, to Russia's turn toward Europe. Within that structure, events align neatly, decisions are made, orders are given, outcomes follow. The narrative moves forward with momentum, and the material world becomes supporting evidence rather than a subject of inquiry in its own right. This way of telling history is not careless. It reflects the sources that survive and the questions historians have traditionally been trained to ask. Chronicles, correspondence, decrees, and memoirs naturally emphasize intention and authority. They describe who ruled, what they sought to change, and how society responded. Architecture enters the story as an expression of power or taste, not as a technical process. Stone becomes a symbol rather than a problem to be solved. As a result, technical questions often fall into the background. How something was built is treated as secondary to why it was built and who ordered it. Engineering details are assumed to be resolvable within the general capabilities of the era, unless they clearly defy possibility. When they do not cross that threshold, they remain unexamined. The presence of granite embankments and foundations in St. Petersburg fits comfortably within a narrative of imperial determination. The city exists, therefore the means must have existed as well. There is also an element of disciplinary habit at work. Historians and engineers ask different kinds of questions, and their methods rarely intersect in popular accounts. Engineering analysis demands attention to tolerances, loads, workflows, and failure points. Narrative history prioritizes coherence, causality, and continuity. When the two are not brought into dialogue, material details are smoothed over. The stone is acknowledged, but not interrogated. This does not imply neglect or avoidance. It reflects efficiency. Narratives are constructed to be teachable and repeatable. They rely on familiar structures that allow complex pasts to be communicated without overwhelming detail. Introducing unresolved technical questions can disrupt that clarity. It can slow the story, complicate conclusions, and open lines of inquiry that do not fit neatly into established chapters. For many purposes, that disruption is unnecessary. Yet the cost of this approach is subtle. Over time, repetition hardens explanation into assumption. What was once an open question becomes an implicit answer. The city was built because the state willed it. Therefore, the means are no longer examined. The granite becomes part of the scenery, impressive but inert, stripped of its capacity to provoke further thought. In this sense, the absence of the question is not a flaw in the historical record, but a reflection of how history is usually consumed. The focus remains on actors and outcomes. Processes fade into the background. The result is a narrative that is internally consistent, academically sound, and materially incomplete in small but significant ways. St. Petersburg still stands. Its streets follow their planned lines. Its embankments continue to hold the river. The granite blocks remain where they were placed, unchanged by shifts in interpretation or emphasis. They do not announce themselves as problems. They simply endure. To walk along the Neva today is to encounter stone that has carried the weight of the city for centuries, resisting water, ice, and time with quiet persistence. Nothing in this endurance demands a dramatic conclusion. The city does not require a hidden explanation to justify its existence. The official narrative remains valid within its own scope. Peter the Great made a decision. Resources were mobilized. A capital was built. That story does not collapse under scrutiny. It simply does not answer every question the material world presents. The granite remains the same whether it is examined closely or passed without comment. Its surfaces retain their precision. Its joints remain tight. Its mass still presses downward into ground that was once marshland. The physical facts do not change when attention shifts elsewhere. They wait patiently for those moments when curiosity lingers a little longer than usual. Perhaps that is where the inquiry ends, not with a solution, but with a pause. The city stands as it has always stood, a product of ambition, labor, and coordination. The stone holds its place without explanation or defense. And the final question, left deliberately unanswered, is neither accusatory nor speculative. It is simply reflective. How much do we truly know about the processes that built the world we inherited, and how often do we accept the result without asking how it came to be?